Hello, good evening, and welcome to our 9th annual Judith Neilson UTZON Lecture, which is proudly part of the school's prestigious Urban UTZON Lecture Series. My name is David Sanders, and I'm the inaugural Judith Neilson Chair of Architecture in the School of the Built Environment here at UNSW. Of course, rightly so, before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge the Bedegal people whose unceded lands we are currently on. I pay my respects to elders past, present, and future who hold the memories, traditions, culture, and hopes of Indigenous Australia. This year's speaker, Professor Daniel Aldrich, follows on from a rich series of presenters, each of whom have talked engagingly about the built environment and challenges concerning disasters, people, and vulnerability. That includes speakers from the UK, from the USA, from India, from Ghana, and here in Australia, who've spoken about a range of topics, from post-disaster shelter, seeing the city from a child's perspective, Joe De Silva just mentioned that, and mapping detention camps in China, to how corruption fuels disaster and challenging race lines in America. I really can't wait, and I really mean this, Daniel, to introduce you in a moment, but I will wait for just 1 second. Before that, we have an announcement, a launch. 3 weeks ago, we launched a new initiative, How We Survive. How We Survive is a long-term initiative funded by the Judith Neilson Endowment in Architecture that's about reshaping how we do post-disaster recovery to put people first. Check out our website, howwesurvive.com. And I've got to tell you, I'm beyond excited to be able to be up at the front here and talk about our first publication, the Disaster Recovery Almanac. And you've seen on all your seats, there's a postcard, there's a QR code. We literally launched it today, and it's amazing. The Almanac will be our annual online publication. And when I say long-term, we have funding in the bank to 2064. So the idea is to build this up over the years, to do one every year. It's intended to elevate perspectives about key issues that need fixing, if you like, to do with disaster recovery. You imagine there's a lot under that brief statement. Each year, we will invite community leaders, and I see Ellie Bird from Lismore is in the room. I saw you earlier, Ellie. Hello, thank you for being here. Who's a contributor, policymakers, practitioners, and researchers, including Daniel as well, to answer a single question. What do you think is the most pressing issue in disaster recovery that we need to be paying attention to? The aim is to provide contemporary commentary about community disaster recovery and resilience. The tone of the publication is key. It's informative, clear, smart, and independent. It's the candid views we're after. We're aiming for the Almanac to become a historical artifact, serving to build a repository of ideas that we can look back to. So please download it. It's completely free, by the way. It's one of those clever things that looks like a book when you do it and it clicks. It's clearly written, provocative, and above all, it's honest. But if you need it to be sold further, here's a quote from our colleague Tim Heffernan in our chat, our How We Survive chat. Tim's right down there. And Tim, I don't know, some of you know Tim. He's a quiet, retiring person, very measured in his thoughts. And this is what Tim says. OMG, what have you guys done? The Almanac is even better, deeper, and more sincere than I thought imaginable! ! It speaks truth to power, just like we discussed, and sets out a clear narrative for change. I've had shivers reading it. I hope you're still shivering, Tim. All right. I'm so excited to see how it's received. Hearty well done. So please take a look at that. It's people like Ellie and others who have contributed to that. The editors are Kate Brady, Liz Keenan, and Natalie Diane. Nat and Kate are down here. And we'll be in the reception afterwards to talk about the Almanac if it's interesting to you. But can I ask you just to join me in an applause? This is a lot of work to achieve. Well done. Great. Oh, I'll put that one up. And so that's good for you, Daniel. So one of the other contributors, one of the key contributors is Daniel Aldrich, which serves as a neat link to introduce tonight's speaker. Simply put, Daniel is one of the world's leading thinkers on social infrastructure, social capital, and disaster. And I should say, Daniel flew from Boston to be here tonight for this and is doing other engagements too, of course, while here. An award-winning author, Daniel has published 5 books, including Building Resilience and Black Wave, more than 100 peer-review articles, and for those in this business, that's a lot of work for each of those articles, and written op-eds for the New York Times, CNN, HuffPost, and many other media outlets. Daniel has spent many years in India, Japan, and Africa carrying out field work with work funded by the Fulbright Foundation, the National Science Foundation, the Abe Foundation, the Rasmussen Foundation, the Japan Foundation, and other institutions, too many to mention, really. Daniel directs the Resilience Studies Program and co-directs the Global Resilience Institute at Northeastern University. Daniel and I spent yesterday morning, hot off the plane for Daniel, with the New South Wales Reconstruction Authority, where Daniel shared his expertise with about 200 people in the room and online for 3 hours. And sparing your blushes, Daniel, many people in the chat said this is the best thing I've ever heard at the Reconstruction Authority when it comes to candid conversations about how we put people in the middle of recovery and get better in the face of those things happening. You were extremely well received. I was there, I saw it. As I said, you just got off the plane and you mentioned to me that while you were flying over, you watched Mad Max in preparation, I assume, for, you're no stranger to Australia, but I'm just saying. But just to say one more paragraph, perhaps more than anything, Daniel is a father of 4, generous, committed, and speaks passionately on how we can get better at coping with disasters, and has his own reasons for getting involved in this subject, as a lot of us do. So please, can you join me in welcoming Daniel to the stage?
Thank you, David. Thank you all for being here tonight. I've put my email address and my Twitter handle up there in case you want to continue the conversation later. You have questions that we can't talk about publicly. And I figured tonight I'll give a talk in 2 pieces. The first piece will be about the social fabric, the ways we connect to each other. And the second piece will be about the places that build that social fabric. How do we create those ties that we need to build connections? David mentioned the reasons I got into this field. It was actually quite personal. If you look behind me, that's our house at 6944 Canal Boulevard in New Orleans, Louisiana. And we moved there in July of 2005. Perhaps some of you know where this is going right now. About 6 weeks later, our house looked like this. New Orleans had destroyed about 80% of the housing stock in New Orleans. Sorry, Katrina had destroyed 80% of the housing stock in New Orleans, including our homes. If you notice, FEMA has written on the front of our house that there's no bodies to be found inside, which was good news for us. All 4 of us escaped. But you see as well that we had a total loss. And our university never opened, the schools never opened for our kids. And for me, wondering about disasters, I began thinking, what will resilience look like? How do we as a family, as a neighborhood, as a city, come back from this moment in history? I think I began to notice early on that the literature out there on disasters had 2 extremes. One extreme perspective argued that everything is about the individual. Are you prepared? Do you have insurance? Do you have a preparedness kit? Food, water, medicine, insurance, which we didn't have actually. And that argument is very Western, the concept that we need to have everything done by the individual. Perhaps at the other end of the spectrum of getting ready for disaster is the argument that you have nothing to do because the government is there for you. The government has done what it needs to do. And behind me is an image of a Japanese grandmother, an oba-san, about 1.2 meters tall. And if you stack her up, you'll see the wall is about 4 oba-san tall, about 15 meters. And that means the government has told residents along the coast there's no need for them to do much in case of a major disaster, a tsunami, a big wave. They already have in place all the things they need to be safe. Someplace between the individual being prepared and the government getting us ready, I would argue, is the real driver of recovery. What we call social capital, the connections that tie us together. And importantly, there are different types of connections out there in the world. Bonding, bridging, and linking ties. Bonding social capital connects people who are quite similar. So if you're a fast-talking Westerner, like me, probably most of your friends are fast-talking Westerners as well. But fortunately for humanity, we also have bridging ties. Bridging ties bring us together across race, ethnicity, background, accent as well. And those ties are often formed in institutions, conferences, after-school programs, clubs. Bonding and bridging ties or horizontal ties. People there at the same level of power. Linking ties, in contrast, are vertical ties. They connect me and the premier, me and the governor, you and someone of power in your authority. And these different ties are critical in a disaster because they bring different types of help. The first reason that social capital, these ties, matter during a disaster is because when the disaster is over, every survivor has to decide, do they go back home to a damaged house, a destroyed business, a wrecked hut, or do they move someplace else? And that decision, whether or not to return, we call exit and voice, of course, after the book by Albert Hirschman. And the costs of rebuilding after a disaster are very high. There are economic costs, the gap between insurance and the actual costs. There are psychological costs, being in a place where you've lost a loved one, lost a pet, lost your friend. And of course, as well, there are opportunity costs. Every day that you're in a space damaged by a disaster, you could be someplace else, starting over again. So why would a survivor of a disaster voluntarily return to that spot they know is vulnerable to future shocks, whether it's a fire or a flood? If you have a strong sense of place, a sense of belonging, the recognition that your friends and family are from that area, that can draw you home no matter what the costs. I remember doing interviews in Japan. An older lady in her 80s told me that she was determined to return to Fukushima, even with radiation there, even with her home being destroyed. And I asked her why. What about it? Why would you go home? And she said her family's graveyard was there. She was raised there as a child. She was determined to die there as well. The ties that she had wanted to bring her home. That's the first reason social capital matters. Then many of the challenges that we face after a disaster require us to work together collectively. We call these a collective action challenge. If you're a member of a club or a faculty, you know how hard it is to get people to work together, to show up at a meeting. So what is the best way to get them to show up? A personal tie, having knowledge of who they are, being able to call them and ask them to show up. That collective action after disaster is even harder to do. You've lost your home, things are in disarray and chaos. How do you organize? If you don't have that sense of connection, a sense of place, much more challenging to get things moving. And finally, if you have strong social ties, if you have those kind of connections, you also have what we call informal insurance or mutual aid. After a major flood, a fire, a tsunami, most stores are shut down, restaurants are gone, even gas stations won't be open. So if you want aid, if you want assistance, it often comes from your network, people that you've met beforehand. Imagine your own house is damaged and your neighbor has some space. You could pitch a tent or put a trailer there for a few weeks. If they've never met you before, it'll be very hard to convince them. This is all pretty theoretical. Let me give you some actual examples from the work that we do to study how social capital impacts disasters. This red dot collection you see behind me clusters on Miami, Florida, just a few days before the arrival of Hurricane Irma back in 2017. And the government began urging everyone to leave, telling people if they stayed in Miami, it'd be very hazardous. Those red dots where people are located begin becoming blue dots as they move away. So we're tracking them as they move out of the area. When the hurricane finally arrives, you see most people have blue dots now, they've moved away. But there's still people who are stuck in Miami who didn't leave. And the obvious question to a disaster manager is, why did so many people not leave Miami when they had the chance? So we began working, categorizing people's connections into bonding, bridging, and linking ties. What kind of connections bring them information and aid? And we found individuals who had broader, more diverse networks, more bridging social capital, those individuals left their homes and stayed away. If the only source of information that they had was a bonding tie, someone that they know quite well, someone who thinks like them, they often were trapped in Miami when the hurricane arrived. So even before the disaster shows up, our social ties impact our behavior and change our outcomes. How about when a major disaster arrives, like in Japan's 3/11 tsunami after the earthquakes there? How can these social ties save lives? So we began tracking along the coast over 100 villages and towns hit by this massive 6-story wave. So imagine looking up and seeing 3 more stories of water coming over this building. The good news was that for many communities along the coast, There were no casualties at all. Everyone got out. But the bad news was that for some communities, they lost 2%, 3%, even as high as 10% of their community was killed by the tsunami. So we have the same damage, the same levels of shock. What's happening in different communities? That mortality varies so much. The most obvious answer initially was the power of the wave. We thought the taller the wave, the more casualties we'd find inside the villages. You can see a bit of a pattern here. Each here dot is one of the names of the villages we studied, but you also see some real exceptions. So look all the way to the right. Tanohata had a 19-meter tsunami. Again, almost 6 stories. Their casualty rates are around 2%. But Onagawa, Rikuzentakara, Otsuchi, they have much shorter tsunami and much higher mortality rates. So we see real exceptions to this argument about the power of the wave itself. So what other factors might be driving mortality? My wife would say my special superpower is being annoying. So I spent about 1.5 years in Japan asking annoying questions. And I noticed sort of 5 categories of answers from people that I talked to: engineers, local survivors, the families of those who are deceased. Many people argued, in fact, from the engineering perspective, the most powerful thing during disaster is physical infrastructure. Do you have seawalls and berms and protective concrete? Engineers told me the more concrete, the better. Underneath that image is Japan's diet, not what they eat, but their national political legislature. And cynical people told me perhaps some communities along the coast didn't support the party in power, and therefore they lost some funding for disaster preparedness. It's pretty cynical, I like it. Underneath that was the argument about the power of the wave, how tall it was. In the middle of the image is of a Japanese grandmother, an obasan. So demographers would argue certain communities have more elderly. Those communities are more vulnerable. What if somehow, though, our social capital is driving our survival? I heard many, many stories in speaking to over 200 survivors. People over 65 told me in many cases they didn't have the time or the strength to evacuate from the tsunami before it arrived. But they had neighbors, friends, and family that literally came to their doors, came to their beds, picked them up and put them on their shoulders and took them uphill. What if over and over again in a community, those tighter bonds, those senses of obligation could save lives? And in fact, that's what we found. The predictor of survival here was the strength or weakness of your connections. In communities along the coast that had very weak connections, more people lost their lives controlling for all the other factors I mentioned. In communities where people were cohesive and worked together, communities knew each other's names, in those communities we had very low casualty rates. So we've seen even before the disaster arrives, when it arrives, we also know the recovery process is a critical element of disasters. So here I put up 9 villages from across Japan, all of whom were hit by the tsunami. And we've been able to scale the level of damage and recovery from 0 to 100. 0 meant nothing was working, no roads, no schools, no businesses. And 100 meant things were as they were before the tsunami. So we've tracked these villages immediately after the wave, 2 years and 3 years later. And you see some communities have bounced back very quickly, the ones in the bottom. Others are kind of a slow recovery, and near the top, very, very slow recoveries. What's driving the process here? Why is it that some communities seem to be bouncing back faster? This is the village of Ishinomaki, taken from the same image 1 week and 1 year afterwards. There's no Photoshop used. These are the real images. You can see the debris is all gone, but there's no people there. So business maybe hasn't recovered very well. This is Tagajo outside Sendai. 1 week, 1 year, and 2 years. There's a white van that's stuck in place. I suspect insurance fraud, but we'll never know. And then one of the stories I noticed traveling along the coast was a strange conveyor belt in a place I'm calling Coastal City. And I noticed it really wasn't taking anyone or any people. It was very loud. I got closer to it. Actually, it wasn't a bridge at all. It was a massive earth-moving machinery crushing up the mountains at the edge of the village and taking that rubble almost 2 kilometers downhill to the center of the village where it dumped it there. Very expensive piece of machinery, only $200 million US to build this. And I wondered how a very small community of 16,000 people, maybe a suburb here in Sydney, could have this level of investment. So being an annoying social scientist, I asked many, many questions, and eventually I got the story. Someone in the mayor's office was close friends with a high-ranking bureaucrat in the Reconstruction Agency, the Foucault. They had been friends from childhood. And he asked him, could our village have a $3 billion pot of Reconstruction money? And the answer evidently was yes, because this is one of a number of ways this single village got assistance. If that sounds unlikely, in fact, we found the same pattern. In communities along the coast that had more support, more large power brokers helping them out, their recovery was better. To the degree, if your village only had one or two of these powerful politicians helping you, your recovery might be around 70%. But as you have more and more of them helping you with these linking ties, you might actually build back better. More roads, more schools, more businesses. So far I've been talking about recovery at the broad scale. How about the individual scale? How might social capital play a role in something like mental health? So we've all been through COVID, so we've all been through a form of trauma. Here are three different patterns of mental health recovery that we see. The top row is the ideal, the middle is more common, and the bottom is among the worst outcomes we could have. In the top row, we have a shock of some kind. A loved one passes away, we lose our home to Hurricane Katrina, maybe there's a shock of some other kind, and we keep going somehow. We manage to keep it up. We don't lose relationships, we don't lose time from work, we're able to keep functioning as we were. The second row, though, is more common. We have a major shock, a trauma of some kind, and we do recover mostly, but occasionally we have flashbacks, occasionally things are hard. On the bottom level is the worst, what we call this PTSD. You have a major trauma of some kind, and the images replay themselves. It's hard to get beyond them, and it's hard to maintain jobs and relationships. So we had the chance to study a major trauma in Japan, not only the tsunami and the earthquake, but also the massive Fukushima nuclear meltdowns there. And 140,000 people had to flee their homes. Some had only 2 hours to get ready. And some have never gone home since. Their homes are still empty because there's still radioactivity in the soil right where they lived. So we had the honor of interviewing several hundred of these survivors over time and asking them questions about their mental health. So when we first began this process, I had two very naive arguments about what would happen. I figured that physical health and wealth would be big predictors of how people will recover. So we figured that if you have a lot of money, you can hire a therapist, you can move far away. But in fact, it turns out no level of income protected you from the mental anxiety of going through a nuclear disaster. Poor, middle class, and wealthy, all of them had same levels of shocks. So too with physical health. We figured that being in good physical health would make a difference. It turns out, in fact, being a tofu-eating marathon runner doesn't help. In fact, what happened was, if you had bad physical health beforehand, your mental health got even worse. Can anyone guess what the single protective factor we found among the people we interviewed? There are no wrong answers. There are only wrong people. Relationships. Well said. The only protective factor we found in all these was having someone to go through these shocks with, having someone who also knew what it's like to have to evacuate with nothing and to try to rebuild your lives. Okay. In case you're curious and thinking, well, these are sort of big disasters, often rapid onset, how about a slow-moving disaster, a trauma like COVID? We found the exact same kind of patterns, by the way. Individuals who lived in communities with strong ties, especially linking ties, they kept COVID at bay, that is to say there were fewer cases coming in, than other communities that didn't have those linking ties. And as time went on and COVID entered our communities, we found that the health outcomes and excess death outcomes were much better in communities where people had these strong social ties. So even during a slow-moving shock like COVID, we find the same kind of patterns. Now, the fun part of my job studying disasters isn't just trying to understand how social capital plays a role, but then how do we build social capital to make us more resilient to these kind of future disasters? I'll just give you quickly a few of the things that we've noticed that actually work pretty well. Maybe some of you recognize the red sweater wearing man there, who's in my childhood, maybe in yours as well. No one watched PBS growing up? Fred Rogers, he was a children's TV host. And every morning he told me, we didn't say Daniel, but he said, be a good neighbor. And his argument was well taken, because if I asked this audience of smart and civically engaged people, how many of you know the first and last names of 10 neighbors, you would all raise your hands, right? All of you know that, I'm sure, right? Yeah, of course you do, because you're living in Sydney, you're smart, you're educated, you're out there on the beach surfing every morning. But the reality is, in most cities in Australia, and in America, and in Japan, and in Mexico, and Canada, across the world, the reality is most of us don't know our neighbors' first and last names. Even more true, by the way, living in an apartment complex, where you may know someone by face if you're lucky, or their name is Hi, right? That's all as much as you know. The problem, of course, with that means, when there actually is a shock, the first people who can be on the scene to help you are not uniformed first responders. They're neighbors. So for example, in my complex of row homes had a fire a few months ago. Well before the fire trucks got there, we helped each other out of our homes. And when someone had a heart attack a few months later, we were on there giving CPR before the ambulance arrived. So I would encourage you to think about this. If you don't know your neighbors' names right now, maybe your homework is to go home, knock on that door with a bottle of wine and say hi. The next level up from neighbor is neighborhood. Beyond the people who live right next door to you, there's a whole neighborhood of people right beyond your immediate neighbors. And several cities that we work with now, including where I live in Boston, but also San Francisco, actually will give you $5,000 every year to hold a party. Why? Because there are shocks coming they can't prepare for. Things, whether it's political or geographic or geologic. But what they can do is build these social ties by having you organize to have an event. Someone's got to get the chips, someone has got to get the guacamole, right? We see who is there, who isn't there. We have to get the band, we have to get the permits. Working together, even to plan the party, shows us what's going on. So San Francisco and Boston take this so seriously, they have a fund just to build these social ties through social events. So we have neighborhood. The third image there is social infrastructure. I'll come back to that in a second. Social infrastructure are places and spaces where we build connections. Bottom left-hand corner are meetings like this one. Someone's talking to you, you're checking your email, you're falling asleep, right? This is democracy at work. It's zoning board meetings, it's school board meetings. And in my town, at least, it's the same 5 people at those meetings all the time. We need to be civically engaged to have trust in the state, and the state needs to hear feedback from more and more of us. So part of our lab's approach is to build meetings that people actually want to go to, where there's more feedback than me speaking at you as your head slowly hits its lap. Bottom is faith-based communities, churches, mosques, synagogues. In Australia, maybe not so much, but in North America, these places still have some power to play. And finally, community currency, that is not a counterfeit dollar. In Toronto, if you volunteer for 30 minutes, read a book to the elderly, clean up some river stuff, nurture a dog, you'll get 5 Toronto dollars. That money can't be spent in McDonald's, it can't be spent at some big chain store. It's only going to work at local mom and pop stores. So we encourage you to volunteer. That money then circulates locally among the businesses. It's a virtuous cycle. All of these plans we've tried in the field, by the way, and all of them have worked. So this first part of the argument has been about the ties that bind us together. The argument that beyond individual preparation, me having insurance, you having a kit, or the government taking care of us, it's these ties that bind us that give us resilience to shocks. Importantly, these ties aren't static. Maybe your community feels right now quite connected, or maybe you feel disconnected. As we'll talk about in a second, those ties can be changed. So I mentioned before the argument that I'd have 2 pieces, the bonds themselves and the places that we form them. So now I want to switch gears and talk about that idea of social infrastructure. I'll tell you a story about Japan, about 2 communities side by side up in Tohoku. For the last 3,000 years, they've faced the same shocks almost every 100 years of major tsunami, large-scale waves that obliterate villages and take lives away. Now, these 2 villages have faced the same shocks, but their responses have been radically different. One community has built the Great Wall of Japan, a massive 2-story concrete monstrosity that surrounds the entire village, as you can see, up to the 2nd floor, keeping everyone safe, or making them think they're safe, perhaps. The Great Wall of Japan. This other village, though, their neighbor, rather than building any kind of seawall or any kind of physical structure, they've built social infrastructure. What does that mean? They regularly hold drills, evacuation drills, where we get everyone in the village, school kids, the elderly, business people, mom and dads, wherever you are. And if you're too old to walk, we literally have wheelbarrows for you, who put you in, like you see behind me, and we'll push you uphill. I've got 2 questions for you to keep in mind. The first question is, which of these 2 communities do you think did better when the tsunami actually arrived on the 11th of March, 2011? Concrete community or wheelbarrow community? And the second question is, where would you rather live? Behind the fort, well protected by concrete, or with no wall whatsoever, recognizing that you might be at the mercy of the elements? We'll come back to those questions, I hope, if you remind me at the end. Okay. We've spent the last year and a half trying to understand the places and spaces where we build connections. And we think, and maybe you'll help me out here, that we can classify all types of spaces into 4 categories. Category number 1, public spaces. This might be a city hall. It might be a piazza if you're from Italy. It might be, in America, an open space. But these are spaces that are free to enter. The community can do whatever they want there. They can hold meetings. They can have a party. Community spaces. The next category are parks. Think about playgrounds, linear reserves, dog walking areas, playgrounds for kids or adults, your ninja course nearby, golf courses as well, right? Open spaces where you can play games and sports. Third category, places of worship, synagogues, mosques, gurdwaras, shrines, temples, churches, places where you get together with a faith-based community. Fourth category, social businesses, coffee bars, karaoke bars, bowling alleys, places where you meet people and play games together. These 4 categories, we think, both, by the way, online and in real life, can capture the most of the plan of spaces we spend our time in. Why does it matter so much? What we found is the following. All 4 categories of spaces I mentioned strongly correlate with higher levels of one type of social capital, bridging social capital. By the way, if this is my classroom right now, I'd give you a quiz and ask you if you remember what that means, but I'm going to tell you what it means. Bonding social ties are those that are homophilous, people similar. Bridging social ties, in contrast, are people different than us. If you notice behind me, we've tried to show that there's very little connection between these spaces and linking ties, so the vertical ties to decision makers, and very little connections to family and close friends. Instead, what's happening is, when you go to the playground with your child, or to the dog walking park with your pooch, you have the chance there to meet someone who thinks differently, looks differently, speaks differently than you. That may sound pretty mundane, but the reality is, in 2024, it's very hard to find spaces left where that happens. Imagine that you're on your phone right now, looking at Facebook rather than listening to this conversation. Perhaps what you're seeing, though, is an algorithm that's been showing you things that sound and look like you. Same thing on the vast majority of algorithmically driven platforms. You're seeing people that have an echo chamber to your thoughts. The likelihood of seeing an opinion that's different than yours on those platforms is relatively low, especially since you can tell the algorithm, don't show me any more of the blue party, I'm the red party. I guess you guys have green, perhaps, as one of your political colors. These spaces are what's left right now in our society, where different political parties can speak together, different backgrounds can come together, spaces where we actually have those connections. Now, that's interesting to me. So when we discovered this, we wondered, well, what if you build one of these places from scratch in a part of town that has no other social infrastructure? Envision, for example, a suburb that's all housing. No parks, no libraries, no bowling alleys, just homes. Or envision, for example, downtown, huge skyscrapers, massive numbers of tall buildings, but again, no social infrastructure. And you build, in one of those spots, a brand new meeting place. So that's what we did, actually. We built one called Ibasho in Japanese, which means my place. Ibasho's board of directors is behind me. They're all wearing their vests. You have to be 65 years or older to be on the board. And we helped build them on the agreement that we could sit in the corner and take notes for several years, which we're still doing, by the way. One of my team members right now is there in the corner. And they got to do all the programming, all the content, what they wanted to do, how it would look, and we got to understand what's happening to people as they come. It's pretty amazing, actually. In a community with no other spaces or places for interaction, we noticed this brand new spot could measurably alter people's connections. By building this new community space, people who came there built new friendships. Their friends' networks got broader. Then their sense of place got deeper. They felt connected to the community, and their belief in their voice also got stronger, efficacy, as we say. So amazingly enough, this one space provided members of the community with a chance to broaden their networks, diversify them, and to feel more connected to where they were. Then we wondered, well, if that's possible, if these social infrastructure facilities have this kind of power, what do they do during a major disaster? What if you have communities in an area that have more of them or fewer of them? Will there be a difference in how people turn out? Will the disaster outcomes be measurably changed? And the amazing thing was, yes. Controlling for, I think, 17 other factors, the density of social infrastructure facilities strongly correlated with the outcomes during that tsunami. What we found was, in communities with more of these spaces, more libraries, more parks, more pubs, more lives were saved than in similar communities nearby where they didn't have these kind of facilities. So people are building connections, they're building trust and cohesion in these spots, and those bonds are then saving lives when the disaster actually arrives. Some people have asked me, Daniel, that's really nice for Japan, but Japan's different than the West, right? They have different ways of thinking, they have different ways of understanding the world. So that's true, they do. So I can show you the same kind of outcomes in North America. I mentioned I lived briefly in New Orleans. So this is the state of Louisiana. We've tracked 20 different counties called parishes there during a number of different disasters. And we compared what happened in those disaster-affected communities after the shock, when the local government had a choice how they spent their money. Local governments can always spend their money on the easy things, large-scale physical infrastructure, building airports in the middle of nowhere. Australia knows about that. Or maybe they also build new roads or dams or berms. Or they can do the hard work and build community-centered, bottom-up kind of facilities. So what happens in a community if you build the road or the library? What happens if you build the airport in the middle of nowhere or that new park? And what we did was we classified all of the investments on two different types of things. Were they sponsored by the government, the state, or by the local community? And was it hard or soft infrastructure? Was it the gray concrete stuff, or these things that build connections? And then we asked local governments, what two outcomes do you care about the most? What really do you want to change after a disaster? And they all told us the same thing. We care about income. We want money to be bigger. We want people to come back with income. And people. We want more humans to come back. So let's take this, looks like mountains, but this is called an average treatment effect. Let's just take the bottom yellow mountain there. That's the consequence for local governments if they invest in large-scale, state-sponsored infrastructure, like roads, berms, and bridges. Income is measurably lower. It's on the left side of that gray bar. And the number of people returning is lower as well, meaning it's not connecting with restoring the community and making it vibrant. So too at the top, if the facilities that they're spending their money on are these large-scale berms, airports, and roads, you see again negative income and negative population. But what if, in contrast, local governments in Louisiana spent their money on bottom-up facilities like libraries, parks, and those kind of things? Then you see income is actually measurably higher, and the number of people come back is higher. So one of my colleagues calls this the reconstruction paradox. Oftentimes after a shock, governments believe that their job is to spend a lot of money on a lot of large-scale things. But the reality is, after a major disaster, what really drives us home, what brings us back to our communities, is the sense of space and connection. You can't get that with an airport. You can't get that with a large-scale dam. You do get that, though, from your favorite barista, from a school nearby, and from other sites of connection. I could show you this data, but I don't think you care. Now, let's think, though, if that's true, if until now everything I've been telling you is accurate, what are the major problems, then, with social infrastructure? The first one is a lack of information. My colleague and I put together a map of North America's social capital, those connections that we have, very easily, using publicly accessible data that we can all access for free. We tried to do the same thing for public infrastructure, and that did not work at all because there is no data set, there is no collection of information on these kind of projects. So the first thing is we don't know, as a society, where are the libraries, where are the parks, where are these being built? And I can say that because we wore out the shoes of 20 undergraduates, making them walk up and down Boston with their cameras to track the 1,200 facilities we have in our city. To get this one graph took us many, many, many hours, hundreds of people hours of work, and the outcome was a bit disturbing. Our city of Boston is blue, it's well-funded, and it's progressive. And we found massive inequity in the distribution of these kind of facilities. For transparency's sake, my community, by the way, is Brighton. Not Brighton, UK, but Brighton, Massachusetts. They're a third away from the bottom. That meant my children growing up had roughly one site per 1,000 people in our community. That meant people in the top communities, Beacon Hill, the North End, had more than 3.5 times more access in their communities than my children did growing up. To get to a library, to get to a park, to get to a video game or a bowling alley, we had a third of their access. And by the way, we're doing okay. Look at the bottom rows here. South Boston, Mattapan, Raxbury, those communities have 0.5, 0.65, far lower levels of access. So if this is a progressive, blue, and well-funded city, I can only imagine how inequitable in other cities that are not progressive and blue and well-funded, we would find this kind of distribution. So data, inequity, and finally balance. And I wondered, if communities have access to these amazing facilities, well, of course they're investing in them, right? They're spending money on them. We took the budgets for 3 different countries. Australia's budget last year on disaster recovery, Japan's, and North America's. 95% of the money being spent after disasters goes to large-scale gray infrastructure. Roads, dams, berms, airports in the middle of nowhere. Less than 6% in all 3 societies go to things like NGO support, parks, libraries, support for the communities there. Even though these facilities typically are less expensive to build and often have multi-levels of benefits, we're still not investing in them. So to wrap up, I begin by arguing that in our societies, we often think about disasters as an individual problem or the government's problem. And it's simply not true. Disasters and resilience, they're a network problem. They're the connection problem that we have. And in communities where we have more of these ties, people survive better and they do better. And the interesting thing is we can build these ties. We're not set in stone. No future right now is determined. That means we can choose to build equitable access to these kinds of facilities so that people in our societies can themselves build resilience to the future. Thank you very much.
Wow. Well, so much to say. We have 10 minutes. I'm going to hold off my question. I'm dying to ask it, but we'd love to open the floor to any questions. There's a roving microphone. If you could give us your name, and I heard someone once say the best questions are not that long and have a question mark at the end. So if you could be our first questioner, that would be absolutely fantastic.
Thank you. Absolutely fascinating. One of our challenges in Lismore is our public spaces took so long to come back. Our art gallery reopens in 2 weeks. So I'm thinking about programming and types of events that we can have in these public spaces to encourage fast-tracking social bridging ties or something like that.
It's a great question, and the reality is I don't know what you need in your community or other communities here because I don't know enough about them. It has to be something that works for the community. So in Japan, chōnaikai, for example, are very popular ways to connect. Those are associations of local residents that wouldn't work at all in Australia, obviously. So we need to think, what would draw people in from the community? We actually joke that there are 3 things everyone has in common. So alcohol, travel, and children. So you're going to be in one of those categories. So oftentimes if universities ask me, how can we sort of jumpstart at the beginning of the semester, I don't say alcohol because that wouldn't work, but I say think of the kind of themes that students would actually have in common, as many people as possible, right? And have an event that appeals to those themes or overlaps those themes. So again, maybe alcohol, pets, and travel won't work at that place, but what would bring people who wouldn't normally show up? Is it the lack of a fee to come in, for example? Is it a certain time when children are home or not home, right? How do we think about maximizing the likelihood that different people would come to an event, not just, again, the people who always come to events, right, but people who maybe don't normally come? How do we get them to show up?
And opportunities to mingle and meet each other.
Exactly.
Thank you. There was a questioner just here.
Thank you. Sometimes one of the key issues with social infrastructure is that you build the library or the community centre, but there's no funding for the operation of it. So it might sit there and you've got to go get the key and, it's used maybe 1 hour on a Tuesday night. Did your research look at how you can activate these or fund the operation of them?
So I wish I'd brought the slides. So yes, actually I've got a book that is hopefully coming out next year. We'll see how it goes. That is all about this idea that has funding as a critical element. So there are really interesting ways that different communities have funded social infrastructure beyond the old standby, which in most Western societies is the municipal bond, where the government floats, in a sense, a loan against the future. People buy them and they're paid back in the future. That really encourages very old school buildings, i.e. structures like this, rather than maintenance, rather than new programming. I'll give you several examples that I studied when I was doing this work. One is the Waqif endowment. Many societies, for example, the local community itself raises funds that then go into something like a place of worship or a local community site. A higher level of that is what's being called now the broader digital mortgage, which is when every household that owns land in a community is asked to give up $100 of capital from their home into a new facility. As that facility improves community levels, all their house prices go up at the same time, rather than developers, for example, being the ones who accrue the benefits. And a third type of approach here is a PPP, a public-private partnership, when we think, well, maybe the library could also be the site of a new cafe. Maybe it could be the site of a medical facility. We've seen in North America a number of co-locations where areas that are having problems with maintenance costs, for example, think, is it being used in the evenings? Is it being used every weekend? Like our libraries where I live in Boston have no funding for weekends, which is a disaster. So you can only go there Monday through Friday, which of course for many students doesn't work. But they're trying to convince them we could have other programming that would bring in funding through other organizations using that space, and then allow you to be open on the weekend. So short answer was, if you email me, I'd be happy to share with you that chapter. But yes, we think there are ways to get beyond the bond as the form of funding for these organizations.
Beautiful. We have time for one more question. Great. Ash.
Hello, my name's Ashley. I work in the New South Wales government. My pronouns are she, her. I'm interested in acknowledging your platform and in the way that we know that disasters impact communities who are experiencing marginalisation and disadvantage the most. How can we work to kind of decolonise ways that we're looking at social capital and provide platforms for recognising intersectionality in the ways that we're examining social capital and social bonds and all of these things that you're talking about?
Thank you. So I think one of the first things to recognize is that many of those marginalized communities have strong bonding connections to each other, but often weaker bridging and linking ties. So this actually happened where I was in New Orleans, where communities in the lower Ninth Ward had incredibly high levels of bonding social capital. We did the interviews there, but didn't know people in the mayor's office, didn't know people in the governor's office, and couldn't activate those ties during shocks. So part of the process afterwards was other NGOs in New Orleans then came and said to them, this is the way that we contact with the mayor, this is the way that we contact with the governor. And then you saw many of the NGOs having a cross collaboration on literally workshops on how do you connect then out of these organizations that are often marginalized by the government and don't have ties. That's the first part of the thing that we've seen. The second idea with social infrastructure is, again, getting a broader, more diverse number of individuals in the same spot. Rather than the same individuals who have been there before, the same individuals who are often showing up at those meetings, we try as much as we can to have a diverse body of people because we get better ideas from that. So in social infrastructure, part of the goal here is these are the spots that are left in our society where marginalized groups or other groups that often don't have a voice or a platform can be part of this new process of political change and broader change.
Beautiful. Thank you. We're out of time, so if there's any questions for Daniel now at the end, we've got drinks and nibbles, but I'm going to sneak in one final question. Okay. It's a very easy one. Okay. You've been to Australia a few times. You have the ears of the highest levels of the Reconstruction Authority in New South Wales, and others know you very well. What's the answer? How do we get better at it in Australia?
I would not be so arrogant as to think I have the answer to that, but I would say what I've seen on my side has been a deep interest to make change with a lot of institutional challenges for making those changes happen. And I think part of this is finding champions in our organizations, individuals who are committed to the idea, whatever their pay scale, wherever they are in the hierarchy, and allowing them to have that platform. Rather than being worried, what will the next government, what will the next premier, what will the next political acts fall in the organization? Part of this is almost the kamikaze approach, where you see the future and recognize it could be that not everyone will survive politically, but nonetheless the idea is so important and so critical to us that we take that risk politically. So I think part of this is a political will, a political risk-taking, moving beyond just the patterns that we always have, which is proposing something that's incremental, that's easy to get done, that's familiar to everybody, and taking those risks and jumping in a space where we all are in the same boat together.
Oh, ain't that the truth? Thank you, Daniel. So there are, before we say thank you to Daniel, we have drinks and nibbles afterwards. Our two editors, two of our three editors, the Almanac, are here right now. Kate and Nat right at the front here. Please go say hello. Please chat to Daniel if you have the energy and the bandwidth and not too much jet lag. And please join me again. Daniel came all the way from America for this, so thank you, Daniel.
Thank you. Thank you.